invite everyone to please take your seats. We will begin shortly. Well, thank you. Thank you and welcome. Welcome to 2025 Saul Green Memorial Lecture. And this year, this lecture is also part of the lecture series on representations of disability in historical, scientific, and artistic perspectives. Welcome to everyone who has come here in person. Welcome to the Green family. Thank you for being here with us. Welcome to everyone who's joining us online, and a warm welcome to our guest and speaker today, Professor Mara Mills. We are delighted to have you here. My name is Dorota Glowacka. I'm a professor in contemporary studies here at King's. I'm also the organizer, coordinator of the lecture series together with my colleague, Dr. Susan Dodd. And I've had this immense privilege and great pleasure, truly, to organize this lecture series. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, the territory which is subject to the peace and friendship treaties, the first of which was signed in 1725, between the Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Wolastoq and the Crown. The treaties provide the basis for peaceful coexistence and good relations for all of us who live here. And I also would like to acknowledge the contributions to Mi'kma'ki of African Nova Scotians who have lived here for over 400 years. And perhaps we will begin with some kind of practical but very important aspects of tonight's event. And for that, I would like to invite my colleague, Michelle Mahoney, who is King's Accessibility Officer. And Michelle joined King's in 2023 as the university's first accessibility officer, and she has also been vital in conceptualizing and coordinating this lecture series. So please, Michelle.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. This has been such an exciting lecture series. This is our final public lecture. And, I want to take a moment to reflect on what we've accomplished together. As the accessibility officer here at King's, it's been an honor to be a part of this important initiative. First and foremost, I would love to add my deepest gratitude to Dorota and Susan for their dedication to this series. Their commitment to fostering these critical conversations has been instrumental in creating a space where disability is not only discussed, but centered, valued, and understood. The goal of the series has been to challenge assumptions, amplify marginalized voices, and engage in meaningful dialogue about disability and accessibility. Through our public lectures, our interactive tutorials, and our upcoming art showcase in 2 weeks, we have explored disability as a lens through which we can critically examine societal structures. We've learned from scholars, activists, and artists who have shared their insights and experiences, expanding our understanding of what it means to live, work, and create as persons with disabilities. This discussion is particularly important in Nova Scotia, which has the highest disability rate in Canada at 37.9%, according to the 2022 Canadian Survey on Disability. This statistic is more than a number. It is a reminder of the work that's still to be done. The province's 2017 Accessibility Act was a significant milestone, setting the stage for progress, but real change requires ongoing commitment and action. Similarly, Canada's Federal Accessibility Act of 2019 commits to a country without barriers by 2040, providing a vision that we must collectively strive to achieve. At King's, we are proud to contribute to this work through our accessibility plan, which calls on us to examine and improve our practices, policies, and spaces. Disability studies plays a crucial role in this effort, challenging ableist assumptions and highlighting the intersectionality of oppression. By integrating disability into our academic discussions, whether in history, science, literature, or art, we equip students with the tools to recognize barriers, imagine new possibilities, and advocate for a more just and inclusive world. So as we conclude the series, I want to thank our speakers and our artists, our activists who have shared their knowledge and experiences. I also want to thank each of you who have participated, whether by attending a lecture, engaging in a discussion, or reflecting on these issues in your own way. Your presence and engagement are what make these conversations meaningful and impactful. The end of this series is not the end of the work, though. Let us carry forward the lessons we have learned, continue asking hard questions, and remain committed to accessibility, equity, and justice. Together, we are not just imagining a more inclusive world, we are building it. Thank you. I also wanted to just mention to everyone in the room that we do have two low sensitivity rooms available if anybody needs to get away and be by themselves. I'm sitting in the back row and I can take you there. Also, washrooms are just outside, or sorry, just outside the building, or outside the door there, sorry. There's an elevator. You can either take the elevator up or down, and there's washrooms on the second floor and washrooms in the basement. Thank you.
And now I have the pleasure of inviting to the podium the president of King's College, Bill Leahy. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the president for your unwavering support for this lecture series. And I don't mean just financially, but also for being here in person for every single event. And that care and engagement really means a lot to us and to all of those who care about accessibility and disability. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorota. Can everyone in the back hear me? Fantastic. Change is happening at King's, and Michelle Mahoney has a lot to do with that change. So I'd like you to join me in giving Michelle Mahoney another round of applause. So thank you, Dorota and Michelle. So it's wonderful to be here with you all tonight for the final lecture in this series, but also as we reestablish the meaningful tribute to Dr. Saul Green that was created, I think, about a decade ago, maybe a little bit more than that. It's hard to believe that it's been 6 very full years since we were last able to come together for the Saul Green Lecture. So with that in mind, I realize that there are people here who may be attending their first Saul Green Lecture. So for those who didn't have the pleasure of knowing Dr. Green personally, and that includes myself, I'd like to share a little bit about his remarkable life as it has been shared with me. So Saul Green was a compassionate, dedicated family doctor and general surgeon. He was a loyal friend, a loving husband and father, and a person of deep faith. As a founding member of Shaar Shalom Synagogue, Dr. Green cared deeply about the relationship between Judaism, medicine, and humanitarianism. He understood that some of the richest territory for expanding our understanding of these great traditions lies in the places where they intersect. His love for encouraging conversations that build connection and community, a love that we like to think defines us here at King's, was the inspiration for this lecture series, and the reason we have this opportunity to hear Dr. Mills this evening. Dr. Saul Green graduated from Dalhousie University's medical school, where he later returned to educate others. Following his service as a physician in the Canadian Armed Forces during the final days of World War II, he established a family practice in Halifax in 1945, along his brother, Dr. Leo Green. His medical excellence was recognized through fellowships with both the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Canada and the American College of Surgeons. His legacy lives on in the lives he touched and the communities he helped to build. On that note, we gather here to celebrate Dr. Green's legacy, and we're joined by his family, friends, and members of the Shaar Shalom congregation, including another Dr. Green, Dr. Roselle Green, who's sitting in the back row. Who was married to Dr. Saul Green and is herself an accomplished King's graduate of the earliest journalism program that the King's offered. Dr. Roselle Green was the recipient of the college's Order of the Ancient Commoner, which is awarded by our Alumni Association in 2014, and she was awarded an honorary degree of Doctor of Civil Laws by King's in 2015 for her long lifetime contributions to learning, communications, and community. I just want to say on a personal note that Roselle is one of the first people that Catherine and I met when we moved into the President's Lodge, and has never ceased to be a great inspiration to both of us, and can always rely on Roselle for a word of encouragement that arrives when a word of encouragement is most needed. Thank you, Roselle. I'd like to express gratitude on behalf of the college to Roselle, her family, and the members of Shaar Shalom congregation for making this event possible. Thank you for helping King's facilitate events that create a rich space for communal learning and challenging conversations. This is an invaluable opportunity to learn together and explore ideas spanning disciplines and traditions that enlarge our understanding of the world around us, and not just the world around us, but also the bodies and minds we inhabit and one another. Today's event, as you've already heard, is the culmination of a very important public lecture series at King's. Over the last few months, this bi-weekly series, programmed as part of the Contemporary Studies course underway called Representations of Disability in Historical, Scientific, and Artistic Perspectives, has provided us with the opportunity to challenge ableist understandings of our bodies, our minds, and our society. Tackling a climate of ableism in our culture, including our culture here on campus, is a key commitment in the accessibility plan that King's adopted in 2022. This plan not only outlines our commitment to improving accessibility by preventing and removing barriers that restrict persons with disability from fully participating in our community and in society, but to advance our understanding of how to make Kings a truly, positively accessible community. And as Michelle had pointed out earlier, we know we have much to do and far to go. The scholars, researchers, writers, artists, activists who we have heard from in the past few months and who have participated as audience members in this series have been an integral part of advancing our knowledge in this area. These lectures, including the one we'll hear tonight from Dr. Mills, facilitate essential conversations, and they challenge us to make meaningful, thoughtful, substantial changes as we work toward becoming a culture that builds accessibility into everything we do. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and especially our students who are here and who have been here throughout the series. And I want to thank everyone for being an active part of these essential and overdue conversations. I'd also like to express the college's gratitude to Dorota, Gloaka, Susan Dodd, and Michelle Mahoney and their colleagues in contemporary studies, early modern studies, history of science and technology, and other programs, as well as members of the Advancement Committee, who have made this series such a resounding success, one that will help facilitate meaningful change at King's, making this a community better for all of us and for everyone. Now I'll hand things back to Dorota. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. And to follow up, why this is our last public lecture, we will have another event on April 1st, which will be a grand finale celebration, an art showcase and presentations by artists from large community Nova Scotia. So I hope you return for that, April 1st. However, this is our last live-streamed event. So I'd like to also extend our thanks to our tech duo, Mark Pinio and Paul Robinson, for making this event accessible to audiences outside this room. So thank you very much. And we also owe a great debt of gratitude to our ASL interpreters, sign language interpreters, Carolyn Carter and Emily Power. Your services have been truly fabulous here every single time, so thank you for that. And I also want to thank a team of student assistants who have been helping out with this lecture series, both behind the scenes and in this room, from tech support to running the mics to postering and so forth, because this wouldn't be possible without you, so thank you. And now I would like to call upon my colleague, Dr. Aaron Wright, to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Aaron Sidney Wright is Carnegie Associate Professor of Humanities and Computing. He teaches in the History of Science and Technology program here at King's and also in Dalhousie's History Department. And his most recent book was published just last year by Oxford University Press, and it was titled More Than Nothing, A History of the Vacuum in Theoretical Physics, 1925 to 1980. Aaron.
It is my pleasure to introduce to you tonight our Green Memorial Lecture, Dr. Mara Mills. Initially, she trained in biology, literature, and education, and worked for 2 years teaching high school biology in California, before absconding to academia and earning a PhD in the history of science at Harvard University. Currently, Dr. Mills is Associate Professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University, where she co-founded and directs the NYU Center for Disability Studies. Across more than 80 scholarly publications, Dr. Mills has woven together threads from disability studies, the histories of science and technology, and sound studies. This multiple award-winning work has been translated into German, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, bringing together communities of scholars around these themes. Specifically, her work centers on media and disability, including media by and for deaf and blind persons, media such as maybe audiobooks for people who are unable to read. She has, of these 80 publications, I'll only mention just one that recently came out, which was a co-edited volume with Jaypreet Verdi and on Sarah Rose on disability history of science. This volume is sure to set the path or markers on many paths for future work that brings together concerns of the history of science and disability. I often assign an essay by Dr. Mills when I teach the history of technology here in Halifax. In particular, an essay on auditory ink blots. Strange, sometimes impossible to understand recordings written in just sounds like any language that she discovered by chance, as she recounts in the essay, while looking at an archive of mostly things like audiobooks for the blind. In this essay, she connects the history of sound production, of materials made for the psychological evaluation, right, of people, of blind persons, some of them made by and for blind persons. So she's bringing that into the history of technology. That's adding to what we're able to do in the classroom. It also is an example of a sort of sensitivity in archival analysis. The ability to take advantage of serendipity, of finding strange things in an archive you weren't expecting, but having the courage and patience to figure out what they were and what they mean, and to put them out there in the world for scholars and students to learn from. This essay and many others demonstrate Dr. Mills' ability to transform this sort of archival serendipity into insight. Dr. Mills' deeply human investigation of science, technology, medicine, and disability make her so well-suited to be the Dr. Saul Green Memorial Lecture, and if we can all join me, please, in welcoming her now.
Thanks so much, Erin. How's my volume? Okay. Okay. Yeah, no, yell if it gets too high or too low. I'm so glad you found that article I wrote on auditory Rorschachs. That I would say is not the article I'm best known for, but I'm glad you're a fan. It's true, I had digitized a collection of auditory Rorschach tests from the archives of the American Foundation for the Blind. And in order to publish the article, I had to publish it in an online journal so that I could embed the audio files, because it just doesn't make sense without being able to read and listen at the same time. But unfortunately, the journal that I published it in, has gone, for a while it was offline. At other times I've had to get them to update the files. So I don't think it's that well read. Okay, it's back up. Thank you, I'm glad to hear that. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for hosting me. Dorota, of course, Michelle, I'm so glad we just met. Erin, we should have met a long time ago, because over dinner before the talk, I realized that we have passed through most of the same spaces within a year or two of each other without meeting each other. And we have some of the same shared good friends and colleagues, so I'm so glad we get to meet. Also Bill, of course, and the Green family. And I know I'm not even, and soon the students who I'll get to meet at the reception after, who I know have been a really important part of this series. So I also just want to note that the History of Science and Technology program at King's is really legendary. My PhD is in History of Science. There aren't very many degree-granting History of Science and Technology programs, whether it's at the bachelor's or PhD level. And the bachelor's program here is legendary. Every single space I've been in, at every stage of my career, I've run into alums from this program. I'll give a shout out to Steph Dick if she ever watches this on, on YouTube, and so many others. So it's exciting to get to meet the people who've made the program what it is. And it's really an honor to be giving the Saul Green Memorial Lecture this year, as it's been restarted after a hiatus from the pandemic. My theme will be the pandemic, a very specific aspect of the pandemic, which has to do with ventilator allocation protocols. And it's also an honor to be doing this in conjunction with the series that's happening this year on representations of disability in historical, scientific, and artistic perspectives. And I've been admiring this series from afar because it's live streamed and it's recorded on Zoom. And I'm in great company. Nicole Enis-Nash, what an amazing scholar. Kenny Freeze. I honestly wish I could have been at receptions with all of them. Lucky to the students. In my talk, I'll be touching on all three perspectives of the series, the historical, the scientific, and the artistic, as well as Dr. Green's emphasis on medicine. So the title of my talk, VENT, Disability Distributive Justice. Let me make sure the clicker is working. Maybe not, we'll do it this way. Yeah, we'll do this. Disability Distributive Justice and the History of Ventilator Allocation Protocols emerges from a 4-year U.S. National Science Foundation funded project that I recently directed at the NYU Center for Disability Studies. This is a provostial center that I co-founded with Faye Ginsburg 7 years ago. At the center, we host public events, we run grant-funded projects, and we organize a number of community partnerships. Right now, our partnership, we're working with small arts organizations in New York City to support accessible curation. So I wish I could attend your event in 2 weeks, actually, your art show. This NSF project, which if you've been following the US news about academic defunding, likely would not have been funded today, culminated in a book very recently, about a week or two ago, How to Be Disabled in a Pandemic, pictured on this slide. A black cover with a mask by artists, the Brothers Sick, with the words How to Be Disabled in a Pandemic on the cover. We have stickers that the press made for us somewhere in the back row. And it just was published. So I have to say your invitation, Dorota, to give a lecture related to this research came at the perfect time for us to celebrate the book, even if it currently seems as though very few lessons were learned in the US about social welfare or even basic public health measures such as vaccination, masking, and the benefits of hybrid options for accessibility. That said, I want to thank you for streaming this event, for those who can't be here in person. I note that there's masks around the room in boxes. I'm not wearing one for speech reading purposes as I lecture. So along with my co-editors of this book, Harris Kornstein, Faye Ginsburg, and Raina Rapp, in 2020, when we got our grant, we assembled a team of 16 or so disability studies scholars, but also grad students, lawyers, activists, librarians, accessibility librarians, actually. Shout out to a member of the Green family who's an accessibility librarian, and also arts workers to chronicle the experiences of disabled people in New York City during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is ongoing, but our research was 4 years. The book itself has chapters on disabled people in city prisons, migrant detention centers, senior centers in Chinatown, hospitals in Queens and the Bronx, subways, schools, housing shelters, social media, and many other locations of public and private life. Across all of the chapters, my co-editors and I, in our introduction, we note what we call the disability dialectic during the pandemic. What we mean by this is disabled people were disproportionately impacted, not just by the virus, but by city and national policies, the topic of my talk today, work and housing conditions, stigma, racism, violence, not just the virus itself. But at the same time, they marshaled disability expertise in practices such as accessible remote work, remote education, quarantine, and online or distributed networks of support and mutual aid. My own research as part of this project, in addition to writing the introduction with my co-editors, was to write a chapter from which this talk is drawn, in which I tried to uncover the rather secretive history of the ventilator allocation protocols recommended by the state of New York for emergency situations in 2015. And these were posted in 2015 in a set of public guidelines that were among the first to be created in the US, and they went on to influence many other departments of health around the country. Needless to say, these guidelines for deciding who would be given a ventilator in an emergency room under scarce conditions during a pandemic, and even who might have their ventilators taken away or reallocated in a pandemic, were fiercely contested by disabled bioethicists, lawyers, and activists, and made up a big part of the news cycle in spring 2020. And the slide I just showed to describe it was a screenshot of the Department of Health website that used to host these guidelines as a PDF you could download. They've been taken down now. You can't access them on the DOH anymore. So the guidelines, I'll explain what their history and what they were, but at their core, they relied on SOFA scoring, or sequential organ failure assessment, an idea the New York government-sponsored committee who came up with the guidelines adapted from Ontario's own guidelines in 2006. So there's a Canada connection here, and maybe in the Q&A, you can help me understand what that connection is a little bit more. The book and my talk will be very focused on New York, but I would like to know more what you think about SOFA scoring emerging in Canada. And I'll come back to this slide. So as a disability historian, my work usually focuses on the first half of the 20th century. This is the period when the terms disability and impairment took on their current definitions and became popularized in the English language. On this slide, I'm showing you as an example a volume of Osiris, the Journal of the History of Science Society that I co-edited last year on disability and the history of science with Jay Preet Verdi and Sarah Rose. If you're interested in knowing more about my work, you can take a look at this volume. The cover is by a deaf artist, Christine Sun Kim, who has a solo show right now at the Whitney. And it's her rendition, rethinking an audiogram, rethinking how to measure loudness in descriptive rather than audiometric terms. For the pandemic book project, I found myself, a historian of the early 20th century, researching much more recent history, working in the State Department of Health archives and working through interviews with people who took part in making the ventilator allocation protocols. In part, my chapter in the book maps the ableism and other biases in the algorithm that was adopted for doctors, nurses, other essential workers in hospitals, and automated hospital management platforms to either exclude or remove people from ventilators during triage. And I expected that. I expected that going into the research. More unexpectedly, the research led me to understand that the disability activist response to the guidelines, which was very effective in changing some aspects of SOFA scoring, as I'll explain in my talk, was in the end mostly limited to a set of rights-based protests on behalf of individuals who understandably want to protect their personal ventilators. But in a way, that set of protests was misaligned with statewide emergency protocols, which are fundamentally distributive justice projects, distributing technology and oxygen and other equipment across regions and across populations. Hence the subtitle of my talk, which invokes the need for a disability activist model of distributive justice, not just of disability rights. And that I'll come back to this concept in my conclusion. So let me start by taking you back to spring 2020. With apologies, no one wants to go back to that moment. The moment when the Saul Green Lecture was canceled, the last one having been the year before. At a press conference on May 6, 2020, noted disability activist Stacey Park Milburn spoke from bed about her fears as a ventilator user facing the COVID-19 pandemic. She said, "It's been pretty scary to navigate COVID-19 as a ventilator user. I saw a public safety alert from Santa Clara County in California asking people to identify if they use a ventilator for a county inventory. I need my ventilator to breathe. My friends and I made emergency plans about what to do if someone shows up at my door asking for my backup ventilator. I was getting advice from friends in medical fields. If disabled people get sick, we may not get care, we may be turned away, we may be discriminated against." In the first months of the pandemic, as hospitals and politicians around the US and beyond began making plans to ration various aspects of healthcare, beds in intensive care units, medicines, and also equipment like ventilators, activists and advocacy groups for disabled people and for seniors demanded that those who were impacted play a role in shaping those policies, which they tended not to have done, as I'll explain in my talk. Milburn was co-founder of the Disability Justice Culture Club, an organizing hub in Oakland, and she also served as a disability advisor to President Barack Obama's administration. Less than 2 weeks after the press conference, on her 33rd birthday, she died as a result of complications from a surgery that had been postponed during the first wave of pandemic, so-called lockdowns. Stories and predictions about the rationing of ventilators flooded the news and social media around this time, spring 2020. COVID-19, I probably don't need to remind anyone, is a respiratory virus. And when patients began overwhelming hospitals in places like northern Italy in February, the world watched in shock as Italian medical societies did enact protocols for rationing ventilators by age and by disability. Part of a triage process typically associated with wartime medicine, these protocols recommended assessing patients for so-called quality of life, the number of remaining estimated life years, or the so-called presence of comorbidities, with resources being allocated to those thought to live longer or to require shorter treatment times. The pandemic crested across the US shortly thereafter. Some states in the US already had crisis standards of care guidelines, or CSCs in policy speak, incorporated into their statewide emergency plans. All of a sudden in 2020, states that didn't have those began drafting them. The New York Department of Health did have one of these plans, and they had circulated their first ventilator allocation component of their CSC, their emergency plan, for public comment back in 2007. This is recent history, but still. And the 2007 draft eventually became these 2015 guidelines. After this point, after 2007, some other states began to include similar protocols in their CSCs. At the outset of COVID-19, in states where guidelines were non-existent or not activated by a government declaration of emergency, hospitals and sometimes individual physicians created their own ad hoc policies for ventilator triage. Triage did happen, and it was sometimes ad hoc, and it was sometimes state-directed. Samuel Bagenstos, who became general counsel for the US Department of Health and Human Services, surveyed the existing ventilator allocation protocols state by state in a May 2020 Yale Law Review forum, And he argued that, quote, crisis standards of care adopted by hospitals and state agencies, again for emergency situations, often employ explicit disability-based distinctions. I'll give you a couple of examples. He pointed to the 2016 Tennessee government's guidance for ethical allocation of scarce resources within that state, which excluded from hospital admission during a health emergency people with, quote, spinal muscular atrophy and people, quote, requiring assistance with activities of daily living. That's a very broad scope and vague. In Alabama, the 2010 state triage guidelines, which were still in existence in 2020, deprioritized people with intellectual disabilities from not just from ventilators, but from other health care in an emergency, and also deprioritized older people. For a much more thorough discussion of the state-by-state crisis standards of care, I recommend the 2021 article by Ari Neiman and colleagues pictured on this slide, which give each state's policy in the US a disability rights score. In 2020, examples very quickly circulated of disabled people, in fact, being denied treatment for COVID across the US as a result of rationing. In my chapter, I give a number of these examples in different states. Perhaps the most famous one that got early attention happened in Austin, Texas, when Michael Hickson, a Black man who had sustained a brain injury a few years before, died in hospice in June 2020 after being refused care on a quality of life premises. So when the New York State Task Force on Life and the Law, a bioethics advisory group established by Mario Cuomo when he was governor in 1985, completed its preliminary draft of ventilator allocation guidelines for the Department of Health in 2007, which went on to influence all these other states' protocols that I just mentioned, it initially recommended the outright exclusion of certain patients from any ventilators in time of rationing. Those with severe burns, metastatic cancer, again, very broad category, and dialysis users. The committee also recommended at that point SOFA scoring to deprioritize a whole host of other people who, according to SOFA scores, would have a likelihood of short-term mortality. Now, the Task Force for Life on the Law was a group, possibly disbanded now. Since I've published this article, I mean, in the last few weeks, the website's now gone from the State Department of Health page. I support this group. I think we need this group, even though I'm mildly being critical of some of their policies. But it was a group of roughly 24 volunteers with expertise in medicine, law, ethics, also religious leaders, and a small paid staff. Their goal was to advise the governor on a range of bioethics issues. Without a group such as that, you have politicians who don't know much about bioethics making these decisions, but it was purposely a group with expertise across many, many domains of life who would be impacted by bioethics decisions. So after they released this 2007 draft, there was a period of internal debate amongst them and public engagement. And 8 years later, they released the 2015 guidelines in which they removed dialysis and cancer from the exclusion criteria. There was a lot of pushback on those two issues. They also included new pediatric protocols. In 2020, people who had completely ignored the 2015 guidelines that had been sitting on the State Department of Health website for 5 years suddenly paid attention to them. They received enormous attention from the press, from bioethicists, from other states trying to model themselves off of them, and from disability activist groups like Not Dead Yet and DREAD-F, if you know these groups in the US, who were, as other states were adopting them, who were trying to push back against them. Despite the international discussion that surrounded these guidelines, most people don't realize they were never formally activated during COVID-19 in New York State. Governor Andrew Cuomo, Mario's son, went so far as to remark in a 2020 press conference that New York State had no protocol for ventilator allocation, even though there was like almost 2 decades of work developing one. Susie Hahn, an ethicist who directed the review and revisions for the 2015 guidelines, the final guidelines, recalls how resource intensive for the state the process of creating these protocols was. She says, New York's ventilator allocations guidelines represent the culmination of almost 10 years of analysis, research, and consensus building. In total, not including staff, 69 task force members and adult clinical work group members reached consensus on the clinical protocol and the ethical principles on which the guidelines are based. So Cuomo's disavowal of these guidelines at the very moment of an emergency in the state was very shocking to the task force. Interviewing Susie, she told me that she suspects he was concerned about political and public blowback along the lines of death panel kinds of controversies that we'd seen for other reasons in the US. That said, even though these guidelines were never officially triggered in New York State, they had very far-reaching impact within and beyond the state. They shaped ventilator protocols at hundreds of individual hospitals and Veterans Administration healthcare centers. In the state, they also influenced the development of CSCs in other states and around the world. I'll just give you one example. California reworked their CSC and their ventilator protocols in 2020, and they extensively engaged with the New York protocols during that process. Now, most disability activists do not contest the need for crisis standards of care in states. Without them, hospitals and individual doctors will and did enact their own, often more biased protocols. So as much as Ari Neiman and his team are giving disability rights scores to protocols, they're not ultimately saying get rid of all protocols. Rather, Neiman and his team have insisted disabled people need to be included in the future in the CSC decision-making process. So to understand where ableism resides in the existing New York State allocation guidelines, and also just to probe the broader questions these guidelines were raising for disability ethics and activism, I decided to investigate, or try to investigate, the debates over almost 20 years among clinicians, lawyers, ethicists, and policymakers that yielded what was ultimately a very fragile consensus on the 2007 draft and the final 2015 recommendation. I was able to review task force minutes, correspondence, hospital tabletop exercises, and other records formerly held, now purged, in the New York State Department of Health records. As it turns out, the consensus on these two sets of guidelines was never unanimous, far from it. The former DOH records also show there was very little input from disabled members of the public or from disabled scientists at the time. This might have been from lack of concern among disability activists at the time. I don't want to say necessarily it was from lack of outreach. Adrienne Ash, a well-known bioethicist who was blind, she's now passed away, became a member of the task force who created these guidelines in 2007, but it turns out in a footnote, she actually disagreed, the one outspoken disabled member of the task force, on the consensus about SOFA scoring. Her dissent was registered in a footnote, noting that she preferred a random lottery for ventilators for its neutrality or objectivity, even if it didn't maximize the numbers of lives saved. So I'll review a few points from these historical sources, and then I'll return to the activist responses to ventilator allocation. And what I'm going to do is argue that we don't simply need more disabled people on CSC planning teams, although we do need that. The history shows there were just very few who were part of the making of these protocols. But we also need new disability imaginaries of what allocation might mean. So ventilator allocation is commonly misunderstood in the press and even among activists to refer to discrete devices and individual users. Ventilator allocation at the state level is in fact an elaborate socio-technical system, to use a foundational STS phrase, involving the distribution of supplies, components, and labor among states, towns, healthcare providers, and finally patients. Wealth disparities, often linked to things like zip code, mean that individual hospitals have unequal resources in the absence of state or national protocols for distributing equipment, oxygen, and workers at institutional levels. So, less than a decade after the New York Ventilator Guidelines were approved and published in 2015, it turns out that very little remains archived or publicly available regarding the committee's work. The Task Force on Life and the Law, like as I've said, has been around for decades. They do have records boxes on many other topics in the DOH archives, but there's almost nothing left in, like literally almost nothing on ventilator allocation. There's very little about their internal research and debates, few minutes, almost nothing about the comments submitted by the public or the revision, writing, and consensus process. I started by submitting a FOIL, or Freedom of Information Law, request with the DOH in 2020 to ask for boxes related to the task force on this topic. I knew that other ones existed. This was only 5 years after the final guidelines were released. Usually you keep records legally for at least 7 years. I was hoping to obtain the task force, specifically Ventilator Commission records, and I wanted to see what kinds of disability participation and commentary had been taking place between 2017 and 2015. What I learned was that the Records Office apparently never received any materials from the 2015 group, directed by Susie Hahn, as well as, who I mentioned, as well as attorneys Stuart Sherman and Valerie Koch. Moreover, the DOH had already purged the materials related to the 2007 draft when the task force was directed by Tia Powell. I think, but I don't have proof, that this has to do with publicity that a journalist brought to those materials, which I'll come back to in a second. So this journalist, Sherry Fink, had previously foiled an early set of Ventilator Commission records in 2009, and she obtained a bunch of material, a 95-page transcript of a 2006 meeting between task force members and an expert work group, 90 pages of emailed public commentary, the situation manual and tabletop exercises that were presented to staff in a demo of the guidelines at the New York Presbyterian Hospital. I'm picturing here just a couple of pages of the big packet that was demoed on doctors and other staff at Presbyterian. Slides and text from public presentations, and also the 2009 summary of focus group discussions that were held and created by a firm called the Research Associates. Fink published 2 articles in ProPublica online about the 2007 draft guidelines, which caused her some concern. There was not a pandemic at that moment, so she didn't succeed in raising a lot of attention about this working group at that time. When she published that article, she actually posted some of the primary sources, the minutes, online, which then were taken down. And I think at that moment, I have no evidence for this, they were probably also purged from the DOH because they caused controversy. She saved all of the records, though, so I wrote to her. She generously responded to me and passed the records along to me. Again, this is not the kind of historical research I usually do as someone working in more traditional archives in the early 20th century. I also wrote to a bunch of the task force members whose names were listed on the initial 2007 and 2015 guidelines, again, which used to be published publicly on the DOH website, no longer. And I spoke to Hahn and Sherman, who were partly the authors of the 2015 guidelines. They had no idea what happened to their hard drives or their email archives after they left their positions. They didn't know that they had not been archived. I also corresponded with Powell, who was the director of the 2007 version of the guidelines. She hadn't been aware that the minutes and the taped conversations, which were supposed to be private, had been archived. So there was not a lot of transparency, even among the people involved, about what was going to be archived and what wasn't. Indeed, though, the minutes of a March 2006 meeting that Powell convened between task force members and a group of outside experts on ventilators were archived without their knowledge. They were unusual in that they were tape recorded and fully transcribed. So full conversation of meetings with doctors across New York and other health providers about what they thought about ventilator allocation. Participants at the meetings were told the recordings would not be saved and that they were for, quote, internal purposes only. And then the separate records of public commentary, the 90-page packet, I'm showing one just image from that packet here, consists of individual emails from private citizens who, of course, they were just emailing the DOH or task force members. They didn't expect their private emails to be archived. So in my talk, also in my article, I will maintain participants' anonymity when citing any of these materials. So things that you would think would be archived, like the writing process of these drafts, the minutes of the meetings, weren't there, and things you wouldn't think would be archived were. I offered actually to return these materials to the DOH. I think they're very important for future historians in understanding how ventilator allocation protocols were developed in New York, because they then influenced much of the country and beyond, but they declined to take them back. So right now they just exist on my and Sherry Fink's hard drives. So reviewing these formerly archived materials allowed me to put together a timeline of the making of the New York allocation guidelines, but also to understand how fragile the consensus was. What's called a consensus on guidelines was actually filled with controversy and dispute. The New York Department of Health initially requested that the Task Force on Life and the Law convene an expert work group on ethical issues in ventilator allocation in an influenza pandemic in March 2006. It was to be co-chaired by Tia Powell, as I mentioned, who ran the task force at the time, and also Gus Burkhead, who was at the State Department of Health. Tia is a psychiatrist and bioethicist. The government was concerned about avian flu, we still are, and was responding to the US Department of Homeland Security's claim that, quote, pandemic influenza was the most likely and most lethal of all threats facing the United States, again in 2006. So the DOH drafted a pandemic preparedness plan in 2004. It was based on the federal plan, the state plan was, and they laid out a bunch of options like social distancing, school closures. The work group was supposed to just clarify the ventilator component, who would get ventilators at this moment of crisis in hospitals. This was critical, as we know, in a period before vaccines became available. So the task force needed help from an expert work group because they didn't all know much about ventilators, and they then convened 36 people with clinical and ethics expertise, including representatives of the New York State Department of Health, health commissioners from across the state, bioethicists, many physicians, and medical directors of most of the major hospital systems, Bellevue, Cornell, Columbia, NYU Langone, my own hospital system, Montefiore, and so forth. They also had law professors and respiratory therapists on that group. And then there was someone from the Hastings Center and the New York Academy of Medicine and the task force as well. So the work group decided that they would work from the principle of saving the most lives with their allocation program, rather than the typical hospital procedure of first come, first serve. You arrive in the emergency room and you are treated at that moment. So that their goal was distributive justice and saving the most lives. Much of their deliberation from the transcripts I read addressed disability, but none of the participants openly identified as disabled. The members of the working group discussed other potential sources of allocation bias resulting from the makeup of the group itself. They talked about the fact that only one person of color was present, and yet they were making decisions about many different neighborhoods and many different hospitals in New York. The presence of Adrienne Ash on the task force, it has been invoked over and over again recently by task force members to demonstrate that there were disabled perspectives included in the guidelines, but that's not true. She wasn't there at those meetings. She joined at the end of 2007. This is a version of something like tokenization, or even what's called crip washing, the use of disabled people or disability rhetoric to justify problematic policies. And no one ever mentions that she preferred the random lottery approach in an emergency. She felt that that was the only fair approach. So prior to the meeting, the work group reviewed an article published in February 2006 by John Hick and Daniel O'Loughlin, physicians working with the Minnesota Department of Health and Terrorism Task Force, who had recommended SOFA scoring as what they thought was the, quote, most useful tool for predicting mortality in an ICU environment. The 2007 guidelines additionally cite the Ontario Health Plan, also published in spring 2006, which also recommended SOFA scoring. Patients with high SOFA scores, meaning high mortality probability, either would not be allocated ventilators at all in an emergency room, they would be turned away or given other treatment, or they would have their ventilators removed and reallocated. This is by far the most controversial aspect of the emergency plan, if their scores worsened over time in the emergency room or the ICU. So you could be excluded at all from receiving one, or you could have your ventilator taken away. Even before someone would receive SOFA scoring in the emergency room, there were some patients who were just excluded. There were initial exclusion criteria that I mentioned to you: severe burn, chronic lung disease, cancer. So they first removed people entirely. That was the 2007 plan. Then they would apply SOFA scoring to everyone else. And I'll say more about some elements of SOFA scoring in a minute. So the New York Ventilator Work Group with the task force essentially adapted these rationing plans that were not yet policies. They were in the US. There was the Minnesota theoretical plan, and then there was the Ontario plan. They thought that they would eliminate quality of life biases that they thought would be subjective estimations, often by non-disabled people, about disabled people's quality of life. And they felt that these would be objective mortality metrics, and for that reason would be much better than quality of QOL, quality of life kinds of protocols, which are also used in hospital systems, and they deserve their own other history. But it was precisely the seeming objectivity or non-objectivity of SOFA scoring and exclusion criteria that came under fire from ethicists and activists, with critics finding them to encode a range of biases, as well as presumptions about, indeed, quality of life. What critics have overlooked is that the guidelines of 2007 and 2015 reached far, far, far beyond clinical algorithms for emergency room and intensive care settings. That was true. A big part of the packets of the guidelines is about who gets a ventilator in an emergency room. But an enormous amount of the deliberation is about fair allocation or reallocation on a much larger scale. Allocating and reallocating ventilators among different hospitals, private and public, throughout the state. At the start of the meeting in 2006, Burkhead noted, and I'm naming him and the other leaders because their names are all over everything, and as the leaders of the work group and of publications. He noted that New York State was already planning to increase the stockpile of ventilators in the state in preparation for a pandemic. But in the open discussion period, it quickly becomes clear that ventilator use requires much more than devices alone. You just simply can't stockpile one ventilator per citizen and have that work. First off, what is a ventilator? People began discussing this at the meeting. One participant mentioned that oxygen supplies would in fact be a limiting factor, and that did turn out to be true, as well as federal patterns of oxygen distribution. Others brought up the issue of disposable materials that were part of ventilators, oxygen meters, cannulas, other tubing, which could not be stockpiled because their integrity gets compromised over time. Far and away, there was a consensus that labor, not technology, would be the limiting factor in a crisis. Healthcare workers would become sick themselves. Some would quit their jobs, some would flee cities. Again, we did see all of this. And already, far too few people were trained in intubating patients and monitoring them on ventilators and maintaining the equipment to meet the needs of a pandemic. Hence, an allocation algorithm was required. You just couldn't have enough ventilators. There couldn't be a one-to-one stockpiling. The task force also debated the question of what allocation encompassed, not just what is a ventilator, what is allocation. Regarding who might be favored as well as excluded, they started by discussing whether healthcare workers, especially those risking their lives to help others during the pandemic, should be prioritized for ventilators if they themselves fell ill. Ultimately, the committee decided that there were too many essential workers involved in healthcare, nurses, cleaners, food servers, administrators, to actually make that kind of determination. So they didn't have any policy for favoring certain people. In the transcript of the tape discussion, there never seemed to be unanimous consensus on the criteria for excluding people from ventilators, even though the draft guidelines did posit some sort of consensus. It may be in other files that I didn't see, but in 2007, the guidelines did have a list that, like I mentioned, chronic lung disease, cancer, cardiac arrest, dialysis dependence, also evidence of, quote, severe or irreversible neurologic events. At the meeting, these were all up for debate, and they were heavily, heavily debated. And it was fascinating to see how messy consensus processes can really look on the ground. One presenter protested basing triage on pre-existing conditions at all, whether it was those exclusion criteria or the SOFA scoring of organ failure. He said, since many of those pre-existing conditions unevenly affect different social groups, disabled people, AIDS patients, cirrhotics, I think it's internally inconsistent to say we can't value life and social work, but then make criteria which do value life and social worth. So quality of life being part of these objective protocols, or the objective being embedded in the social, he's pointing out. In the public commentary on this draft, after it was published, dialysis as a criterion for exclusion from ventilator access generated by far the most pushback. I don't have time to explain all of the pushback, I'll just mention this one because by far the most pushback. From nephrologists to advocates at the National Kidney Foundation, people wrote into the task force and also to the Department of Health. Also, the working group had an email hotline to explain the internal diversity of dialysis patients, treatments, and outcomes. In response, the 2015 guidelines were amended to remove dialysis as an exclusion criterion. So after the exclusion criteria, the working group debated the next step of exclusions, SOFA scoring, as a way to assess short-term mortality of other patients in emergency settings, including some disabled, some seemingly non-disabled, and how to deny ventilators to those with worse or higher scores, even if they had passed that initial exclusion stage. Meeting participants disagreed on SOFA scoring. They queried whether SOFA measures would even be suitable for an unknown pandemic to come. Emergency medical services, people pointed out, frequently intubated patients in ambulances or in their homes. Would EMS have time to comply with scoring protocols or to coordinate with ERs and ICUs regarding all the people waiting in line at an ER or an ICU? There was a sense among a lot of the physicians that this was not going to be practical, it was not going to work. As a third step, the controversial step, SOFA scoring was meant to be applied, again in the guidelines that this group came up with, at fixed intervals after a ventilator was in use. And any patient showing worsening scores of a certain level would have their ventilators then removed and reallocated to newly arriving patients with better scores. The timing and cutoffs for the secondary scoring and the idea of extubation itself became a major topic of debate among the work group. And they were tested in the tabletop exercises I showed on a previous slide. The 2007 draft guidelines do reflect this uncertainty, even if the 2015 guidelines do not. They note that the working group, quote, struggled with the notion of removing less ill patients from ventilators, particularly those who might have recovered with continued mechanical ventilation. The guidelines clarified, however, that chronic care facilities would, quote, not be subjected to these acute care guidelines. This is important because this was a misunderstanding among a lot of activists pushing back against the guidelines at the time. Disabled people using ventilators at home or in chronic care facilities were not supposed to be triaged under this proposal, as has been commonly misunderstood. But any ventilator user entering a hospital or other acute facility would be subject at that point to the same protocols as everyone else. So someone newly given a ventilator, if their scores were worsened, they could be taken away. Someone who is a chronic ventilator user who came in could have it taken away if their scores worsened. And that remained quite controversial. One participant in the 2006 meeting pointed out the potential ableism of employing SOFA scoring in a repeat pattern at all because, quote, people could argue that their disability differently affects their recovery, so the medical criteria should be applied to them differently. Could you really apply SOFA scoring at the same pattern to every person? Another person suggested that it was, quote, reverse discrimination against the critically ill to not apply the protocols to everyone who required ventilation. And then the working group devolved into a discussion of who is considered disabled. Is everyone who requires a ventilator at least temporarily disabled? And they didn't answer that question. Although the use of exclusion criteria and SOFA scoring to withhold and withdraw ventilators dominated disability activism during COVID-19, especially that withdrawal step for chronic disabled ventilator users, the working group also spent a lot of time debating regional allocation. For instance, if New York City was hit first, would rural hospitals have to transfer their ventilators to the city? How would they get their ventilators back if they needed them? If smaller hospitals typically send patients who need specialist care to the city, would they have to deny their patients access to urban resources during pandemic lockdowns? The working group was also concerned about poverty and other forms of inequality, creating vastly unfair patterns of allocation between different hospitals, even in one city like New York, with wealthier people able to hospital shop. We also saw in New York people just having boutique private doctors and buying ventilators and buying labor to, stockpiling labor and ventilators for themselves. This inequality pertained to disability in very unexpected ways. With wealthy and, quote, well-organized disability rights and disease advocacy groups being thought by this committee as likely able to obtain more resources and better care than disabled and non-disabled New Yorkers in lower income neighborhoods. This was something I hadn't expected. So I'll give you a few quotes to convey a sense of the debate. I'll say a few things about what happened and the disability activist response afterward, but just to give you a sense of the debate anonymously, here's some outtakes from the meeting. Not all hospitals are created equal. Hospitals in less affluent neighborhoods typically serve a larger population base. Thus, a system of rationing that permits wide variation between hospitals in different areas will likely result in excess mortality for the poor. To what extent do you think there's a potential for people buying themselves out of the system, setting up private ventilator clinics or some other deal? It's gonna happen, it's New York, it's the US, it's a capital, it's a market-driven system. This did happen. People who have not been well served by the healthcare system until now are likely to have chronic conditions. Again, they might not identify as disabled, but the medical system identifies them as disabled. Chronic conditions which will weigh against them in SOFA scoring or whatever triage system we set up. So it's really not possible to create just plans and programs in an unjust system. And I'll read just one more. Community participation doesn't always increase justice because some people are much more organized. Specific disease group advocates are in fact extremely well organized, much more so than the vulnerable poor. So that's just to flag the fairness of that. They're raising the idea that certain disability groups might themselves have access to more ventilators than other disability groups or than other disease groups, depending on level of money and organization. None of this makes it into the guidelines. This is the non-consensus and debate behind what looks like consensus, especially in the 2015 version. So the 2015 revised version, revised from the community complaints that became so influential around the country and controversial, built on the draft that came from these conversations and public commentary, as well as focus group sessions organized by the task force and the research group they hired. Very few people, mostly health professionals, and almost no disabled people, except dialysis activists and advocates, emailed their reactions to the publicly posted 2007 draft. Powell attributed this to, quote, fatigue from the public in hearing about pandemic flu. I don't know why. They did try to get input from community members through focus groups and email hotlines. They didn't get a lot from older people who were hard hit by COVID and from disability groups. The 2015 revision ended up maintaining the overarching goal of saving the most lives. Again, this was chaired by, not by Powell anymore, but by Hahn. SOFA scoring was maintained. There was a little bit more specificity regarding timing. And like I said, they restricted exclusion criteria to short-term mortality. They got rid of a lot of the descriptive phenomena like dialysis use and metastatic cancer. So in 2020, after all of this, and this is just a fraction of the debates behind these guidelines, New York State never invoked them. They spent so much money and dozens and dozens of experts to create them. And because they didn't invoke the guidelines, there was unequal access to ventilators in the state, and it's thought to have resulted in a complex way both from the absence of a statewide protocol, which would have managed some of the hospital disparities. The regional and hospital disparities weren't managed at all because there was no state protocol. But also, hospitals themselves implemented ad hoc plans, sometimes based on quality of life, which many disabled people have shown can be quite ableist. It's a subjective sense of someone's quality of life. Or some hospitals voluntarily followed the guidelines, even though they weren't invoked. And in that sense, those hospitals were enacting some of the biases in those guidelines. It was chaos. It was absolute chaos. And prior and current members of the task force have published about what they call the disarray, more politely than I'm saying chaos, in New York hospitals during the first months of the COVID-19 pandemic, before vaccines became available, because of the void in state guidance. They had felt they spent a decade or more of their lives to create guidance that was ignored, even if some hospitals were enacting it on their own. The planning burden was placed on departments or already overwhelmed medical staff. Examples abounded in 2020 of efficient or unequal allocation between institutions. It was widely reported, for instance, that Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, an epicenter within an epicenter at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in New York, quickly exceeded double capacity in March 2020, while hospitals just 20 minutes away had open beds. Allocation of protective equipment was not well thought out, so hospices across the state, which had ventilators and staffing and could have admitted patients with COVID, didn't have PPE, so they couldn't admit those patients. There's many more examples of the chaos of not having state guidance that I could give you, but we don't have time. The 2006 work group also warned that different divisions within a given hospital would probably diverge in their interpretation of triage protocols. If any of you who are physicians, this won't surprise you at all. For instance, one of them said, it would always be the job of the physician to advocate for their patient. And so the ICU physician is going to advocate for their patient. The ER physician is going to advocate for their patient. I interviewed a bunch of physicians who had to deal with either coming up with ad hoc protocols or using the New York protocols. At this time, I'll just give you one example in the interest of time. One physician told me that their New York hospital system created its own ECMO allocation guidelines. This is one step beyond a ventilator. One step more serious kind of ventilation. And they created their own guidelines early in the COVID-19 pandemic for extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. And those guidelines did potentially involve withholding treatment from those who would have received it during non-pandemic times. This doctor hadn't been aware of the 2015 guidelines until they read an article about them in the newspaper. They read about the protests around them because they weren't activated. At the weekly meetings of the ECMO programs in their system, again, it's multiple hospitals across one city, it soon became clear that some of the sites were following the internal guidelines much more stringently than others. With disposables running out, the larger hospitals just stopped reallocating materials throughout the system. This is just one hospital system, all hired by the same people. It was hard to get allocation to happen there. The ECMO physicians were under very conflicting pressure from other departments within their hospitals, including the person I interviewed. Managers demanded that guidelines be adhered to for labor, cost, or legal reasons. ER doctors and intensivists were calling over and over, this is a quote from the doctor, day and night to beg for the rules to be waived on behalf of their particular patients. In fact, this physician recalled that one of the hospital bioethicists, whose name I recognized as a member of the task force who had created the state guidelines, had called them advocating on behalf of a patient who did not meet the hospital's own criteria for ECMO. This is a sign of just how difficult it is to shift from a model of autonomy, physician autonomy and patient autonomy, to a population-based or distributive justice approach, which is called for by a state in emergency times. Even the people making these guidelines wanted to save their patients. So many other task force members have documented occasions now when ventilator rationing following the 2015 guidelines, again, they didn't have to follow it, but they chose to, did occur in New York and did result in withholding and withdrawing. I'm sure my hospital system, Langone, NYU asked doctors not to talk to the press and to sign NDAs. So there's a lot of stories that have not come out. I'm sure more will come out as time passes, but we have with publications, and I have done some interviews with some examples. A bioethicist, Joseph Finns, for instance, argues, quote, although the official line from the state was there were enough ventilators to go around, the reality is that the system buckled. At the peak of the surge, multiple patients were in need of intubation at one time. Not all could be helped. He quotes in this article an April 2020 listserv post from an ethicist at Lincoln Hospital who wrote, I work at a city hospital in the South Bronx, in one of the parts of the town most impacted by COVID. We came to the brink 3 weeks ago with no available ventilators of any kind, and we implemented step 1 exclusion criteria of the New York State ventilator allocation guidelines. The patients withdrawn from ventilators that day without advance directive or family permission were those with true physiologic futility. That's just one example. Shortages of oxygen concentrators and oxygen itself were also widely reported in New York and also around the world, not only in hospital settings, but for home use and for those who were newly disabled by post-COVID symptoms and sent home with oxygen concentrators. There are so many more examples of rationing that did occur that is maybe not always officially documented or recognized. So prominent activists have responded to the triage plans, either speculated about or posted as guidelines on these websites, or the triage plans enacted in 2020 by particular hospitals, in short, by demanding new state protocols. Again, not the elimination of state intervention, revised with input from disabled people. Ari Neiman's team has also called for a reinterpretation of, quote, short-term mortality risk as the supposedly objective basis of step 1 and 2 ventilator exclusion criteria. He supports the principle of optimizing the number of lives saved. So that's in distinction from Ash, who another disabled bioethicist who preferred lottery. And he argues that, quote, short-term mortality risk needs to be interpreted more narrowly to avoid unnecessarily screening out individuals with disabilities. Our preferred standard, his teams, would be survival just to hospital discharge. As another example of protests with specific asks for changes to these guidelines, Not Dead Yet, Disability Rights New York, and Neuromuscular Disability Support United filed a lawsuit in 2020 against the state, demanding that the allocation guidelines be amended to prevent chronic ventilator users from having their devices reallocated in acute care settings. They lost that lawsuit. The activist group DREAD-F has protested a very specific element of SOFA scoring. SOFA scoring, I'm glossing it here. There are many different measures for blood work and oxygen and other measures for estimating different kinds of organ failure. So different disability rights groups have pinpointed very specific elements of SOFA scoring. I'll give you two examples. DREAD-F has protested the use of the Glasgow Coma Scale in SOFA scoring, which measures consciousness, so-called consciousness, through eye, motor, and verbal responses, and hence can inappropriately lower the scores of people with speech and motor impairments. Along similar lines, ethicists Harold Schmidt, Dorothy Roberts, and Nwamaka Enyana have highlighted racial bias in creatine measures that are also part of SOFA scoring, explaining that, quote, creatine is higher in Black communities because of the higher rates of chronic kidney disease due to higher rates of diabetes and high blood pressure that can be understood as the consequences of health inequities and structural racism. The state of Massachusetts recently modified its CSC guidelines by reducing the weight given to creatine in SOFA scoring. And Neiman and his team reviewed that and argued, quote, this represents a precedent-setting extension of the disability rights framework of reasonable modifications to other systemic inequalities. Much, if not all, of the disability activism and critical analysis surrounding ventilator allocation still remains focused on withholding and withdrawing rights from individuals. It's either about amending SOFA scoring, or it's activism about how patients can protect themselves in the hospital setting. Disabled people are experts on rationing. This is a form of disability expertise, especially in the US in a privatized context that generates scarcity around healthcare, even in everyday times, not to mention in ableist context where implicit triage is the norm. And I didn't give you the examples of just so many people who had ventilators rationed at the very beginning around the country, but it was very much on people's minds. So this kind of rationing expertise manifested throughout the pandemic in many, many advocacy and mutual aid projects, many on social media. One is Nobody is Disposable, a hashtag campaign launched by Patty Byrne of the well-known disability group in the US, Sins Invalid. It was launched before the pandemic, and then it became a multi-pronged campaign against triage discrimination in 2020. The campaign included a vital open access publication, the Know Your Rights Guide to Surviving COVID-19 Triage Protocols, pictured here. It offered a toolkit with detailed and clear instructions for disabled people who used ventilators, including necessary legal documents to bring to the hospital. For instance, the contract you have for your ventilator, either showing that you own it and aren't renting it from an insurer, or showing what the contract you have with the insurer is. The toolkit also mentioned what cities and even hospitals had the most favorable laws or triage policies. A lot of research went into figuring that out in this moment in 2020. How to find an advocate, how to engage with triage committees, what items to bring to the hospital, and more. So some people said, hey, we need to change CSCs. Other people said, how can we advocate within the existing very flawed system? And my last slide, I told you there would be some art in here somewhere, Dorota, to hit all 3 points of your speaker series. On Facebook, as one other example of mutual aid, there were many disability mutual aid groups in 2020 and 2021 for sharing things like medication, hormones, and devices when supply chain issues, job layoffs, and shutdowns made them difficult to access. On this slide, I'm showing you an artwork by disability artist Alex Dolores Salerno. consisting of a coded phrase embroidered onto a pillowcase, translated as "please be discreet," carefully disguising any medication words, taken from one of these Facebook mutual aid groups where participants were writing in code, given that medication sharing is illegal. So we have groups that are advising each other on rationing. We have groups that are trying to engage in mutual aid around either rationed items or items that just were gone because of supply chain failures. So to conclude, I want to say that taking into consideration the very broad scope of allocation in state or national guidelines and the expanded definition that we have to work with of ventilators as complex technical systems, might it be possible for future disability mutual aid projects to emerge around oxygen inequity? We didn't see that in any of these kinds of groups, but could it be possible? Or around the limited unequal availability of ventilators, oxygen concentrators, disposables, and even oxygen itself. The question remains as to how disability expertise might be extended to regional or population-based allocation. We have wonderful ethics groups. I've mentioned Ari Neiman, there's many others, looking at how to reform SOFA scoring. Might we have work that's also putting disabled people on task forces to rethink CSCs and to come up with a disability model for regional allocation as well? Medicine and disability rights have often been seen as at odds with each other, but both are in fact dominated by an autonomy model focused on individuals. And this creates friction, as we saw, for distributive justice projects with societal or social implications, which by definition a state emergency plan is. Some of this friction is a necessary and urgent check on biased or profiteering managerial protocols for distributing labor and resources. I didn't even get into the profiteering aspect of this, people who were finding ways to exploit the lack of state guidance to make a lot of money selling equipment to certain people. Building on the disability justice movement and the cosmos of mutual aid that exists at a grassroots level, what remains to be imagined and will be asked of the disability ethicists and activists who do, I hope, contribute to the next set of state and federal ventilator allocation guidelines is a theory of disability distributive justice. Such a theory will require thinking across disability identification, existing disability activism, and those groups of people marked by location, class, race, citizenship, for debilitation, and who are otherwise written off for their comorbidities during pandemic times. So I'm going to close there, and we have a little time for questions. And I'm not going to call on anyone, but I do want your thoughts on how the Ontario protocols for ventilator allocation worked. You have a very different system of healthcare allocation here, so I'm curious about the Canadian perspective, but I won't call on anyone, and first I'll turn it to you. Should I sit down?
No. There's a question. We'll just have 10 minutes of questions. And then we'll go and have our reception. So, question back there.
I was really curious, you mentioned APNF.
Yes.
And you mentioned her idea of the lottery. And I'm curious to hear more about that. And I'm also curious, you talk a little bit about the kind of emotional reality of how it's different to imagine these systems versus actually encounter them, how the bioethicists, ask for an exception even if you make the rules. And I'm wondering if you have any kind of thoughts on the maybe even the psychological angle of the potential for like rigging and exceptions. Any kind of, I was really
Yeah.
curious about the lottery, and I just wanted to know how.
Well, there are many great parts to your question. One of the things I heard in your question is about having to do this decision-making process. And one thing I briefly mentioned in my chapter version of this, a lot of doctors they wanted to have someone else make the protocols and have a triage committee make these decisions. There are many medical professionals in my own family. I heard a lot of these stories firsthand. You're in a crisis setting. You don't also want to have to be the person going through these protocols necessarily. Some people, yes, wanted autonomy and agency over their own patients, but very few people want to be coming up with protocols with a long line of people waiting for a ventilator and having to say no. Among the new disabilities that arose during COVID, we have long COVID, but there was also a lot of talk about trauma and PTSD. That New York State Department of Health, in fact, they may still have a COVID PTSD webpage up, a lot of which was directed at medical professionals. We had widely reported in the news medical professionals committing suicide during the pandemic, people working around the clock, people leaving the medical profession, a lot of people leaving New York City. It was, you know, I don't have a pointed critique at any one person, and I hope it doesn't sound like I do. This was a horrible, complex situation, and most of the members of the task force feel that it became unnecessarily chaotic because of no government guidance. So making those decisions is quite hard and traumatic even for some people. The lottery approach, I mean, Adrienne Ash was at the time already a very well-known bioethicist, one of the first sort of disability bioethicists. There are many of them now. I could also point you to like Joe Stromando, who I cite in the chapter but not in this talk. She was kind of alone on the committee at that moment. She had a very strong personality and strong voice, but her perspective was reduced to a footnote. So if you look at this document, her name and thoughts are literally a footnote on page, I don't know, I'm just gonna say like 80 or something. So I don't think she had enough critical mass to get that perspective across. And she joined in 2007, a year into the deliberations that had already been ongoing. She has since passed away, so I couldn't interview her. And her own personal papers were never donated to any university. This is the point where every historian pitches to all of you, please preserve your manuscript collections or relatives' manuscript collections, because it's very hard to tell. I wanted to know what she actually thought, and I was hoping there were like letters, correspondence, diary entries about her time on this committee. But if there are, either they've been lost or destroyed, or her family has them. So, you know, it's interesting. I'm sad to see that the task force webpage has been taken down from the New York Department of Health. I think we need a task force, and it needs to be as professionally diverse as it was already, and it needs to have many, you know, disability is a very internally diverse category. It needs to have many people from the very different disability communities on it. And yeah, I'd be curious to see if the result is random lottery. That only solves the problem of allocation for individuals in a hospital. That doesn't solve the problem of statewide allocation. New York State gets oxygen from pure medical grade oxygen from a federal source. So there's, you know, states are being allocated, then those states have to send materials to hospitals. This was a very hard project. It turned out, ventilator component of an emergency plan sounds small. It was very complex. So the lotteries would only be for that emergency room ICU stage.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
That's great. I can't help but think about two very famous New Yorkers, each of whom President of the United States. One, Franklin Roosevelt, who theoretically would have been denied a ventilator,
Yeah.
probably not in practical terms, but theoretically. And
From the scoring, yeah.
And the current President of the United States, who has openly mocked disabled people.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think disabled rights
Yeah, so this is the $1 million question that I'm spending, going to multiple meetings a week about. To the first part of your question, I want to say, as a slight aside, but I think one that will interest this group, New York's Manhattan is one island among many, and the history of New York is the history of excluding disabled people onto other islands around, it's an archipelago around Manhattan. So Rikers Island is still where a large prison is. Roosevelt Island is a place where there were and still are institutions for disabled people, as well as a monument to the history of disability rights with a statue of Roosevelt in his wheelchair. So there's one hospital called Kohler on Roosevelt Island for people who use ventilators or other kinds of oxygen. There were a lot of people during COVID who were placed in Kohler. It's the most vulnerable population to COVID. There's a wonderful documentary created by disabled people in Kohler that we cite a lot in our book called Fire Through Dry Grass. I want to recommend this just because you mentioned Roosevelt. Oh my gosh, so during the first week of February, I went to a meeting with a bunch of disability rights lawyers, as well as, because I'm a professor, university access coordinators who reflected on Trump's first administration and were relatively calm about changes to things like the ADA and 504s based on what they saw in the first administration. Now, since then, a lot of things have changed and escalated that we didn't see in the first administration. There's so many different laws governing disability, whether you're talking about international laws around internet accessibility, WCAG, which possibly wouldn't be touched by the US government or radically changed. It's an international set of standards, to things like the ADA, which is an act that has many, many, many laws over decades attached to it that iterate differently in different states. So you're asking me a very big question. What most people have been saying federally, the really stigmatizing rhetoric that's coming out of the White House is itself a huge problem. It's a dangerous problem. It's a problem for employment. It's a problem for people not asking for accommodations that they deserve because they're afraid that they will be denied them, even if they haven't been denied them yet. There's a climate and rhetoric that's very ableist right now, and that in itself, it creates so many different risks, even if accommodations haven't changed, even if the ADA hasn't changed. And because so many of our US government agencies are being either shut down or winnowed away to nothing, they can't do the enforcement that they used to do. Wealthy people will still be able to hire a private lawyer in the United States and look at a law and say my rights are not being met at my workplace or my school, and possibly address it through private litigation. But usually government agencies are the ones that most people turn to, like the Department of Education, to protect them or their kids in an educational setting. If, for instance, 504s, which are our laws regarding like accommodations in classrooms, have been around decades, but without agency oversight, what's going to happen? So I think there are so many prongs to this, and people are less worried about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, being fully dismantled than just with there not being agencies to make the laws that exist in given states enforced. And that's a very partial answer to your question. Then there's so much more to be said. Maybe when we're in the reception, I can tell you some of the other meetings I've been in and stories I've heard. Separately, there's no anti-DEI rhetoric, which is absolutely absurd. Uptake of an administrative term that a lot of us don't use, and weaponizing it to try to cancel every single thing under the sun. We have never, the ADA has never successfully resulted in disabled people being employed in high numbers in the United States. So the idea that there's this problem with DEI providing employment for disabled people is absolutely untrue if you look at the numbers. My colleague Sarah Rose has written a book about the rise of workers' comp in the US much later than in Canada or Europe, and the fact that in the US, workers' comp has always been weaponized as a way to prevent disabled people from getting jobs because they're thought to be expensive, because they are more likely, it's thought to have an accident, have an expensive injury. Since the rise of workers' comp in the early 20th century, again, look at Sarah Rose's work, there's been a radical exclusion of disabled people from the workforce. We also don't really have a social welfare state. So disabled people who can't work have very limited Medicaid, state aid for healthcare, and very limited SSDI, SSI state payments. The government seems, possibly Elon Musk is going after Medicaid. That a lot of disabled people rely on that for their only health insurance. That will be, if that happens, a serious problem. But there's rhetorical fictions that make absolutely no sense, like the fiction of so many disabled people being employed in jobs they shouldn't have. No, the truth is there's total underemployment because of things like workers' comp being weaponized against people, and there's no social safety net, or a very limited one. So how do you live in a nation, a society? This is not you, you're in Canada, but that where there's a double bind. No, you can't work, and there's no social safety net. So, and those are long-standing problems in the US. But yeah, we also have to keep our eye on Medicaid, a huge issue. I could probably take one more question. Or if someone wants to give the Canada perspective on, if anyone knows about ventilator allocation or rationing in Canada, I'd love to know. No pressure, you can just ask a question too.
To your point on the SOFA score, I've used it on both sides of the border, under some of the protocols mentioned, and it is taken very seriously here. I think due to a lack of autonomy, whereas in an American hospital serving a deeply poor and racialized population, the physicians took it upon themselves to modify specifically the creatinine score to reflect the population's different needs. But the question, you mentioned briefly, I don't remember your exact phrasing, but whether or not all people on ventilators were disabled.
This was a quote from the working group who was saying, how do we decide between a person who's newly entered the hospital and needs a ventilator and someone who doesn't identify as disabled, and perhaps someone else who does, yeah.
Does self-identifying as disabled matter in that case?
Not in the way the protocols ended up looking. It didn't matter at all. There were the few people who pushed back and said, we can't apply the same scores to everyone, and they gave either reasons based on like race and creatine, or they gave reasons based on disability. But in the end, that wasn't part of the 2015 guidelines. I hope you're writing, it would be amazing for you to write some sort of memoir or blog post or something about, no. Too traumatic, too awful, or okay. All right, fair enough, absolutely fair enough. Yeah. Probably someone is writing an entire book on the history of SOFA scoring right now. It's much more complex than I'm letting on. It is better than QOL or ADL. There's a long history in disability activism. There's been a long history of people pushing against philosopher Peter Singer. If you know anything about disability activism, you know that. He was a big proponent in the 80s of quality of life metrics, QOL metrics, which have also been used in a lot of hospital settings. we need a history of QOL. SOFA scoring is thought to be better than that. That's why you have people tweaking it, these activists tweaking it and not necessarily getting rid of it. But each of these systems, and the other thing I should say that I briefly mentioned in my chapter but not here, a lot of this is being automated now, which maybe would be a problem for the more flexible, fine-grained systems you've employed or seen. So I went to a lot of hospital management meetings in 2020 and 2021 where programmers and managers were like, how do we just get nurses already use iPads, but they're like, how do we just do the SOFA scoring and decide who gets a ventilator or whatever, or a bed or whatever other thing is being rationed just based on what's being input into iPads. Like, we'll take the decision making away from humans entirely. And that is a whole separate problem for the next set of guidelines to come. Thank you. Shall we repair to a reception?
There's a couple of announcements.
Thank you.
So thank you so much to our speaker. Just before you run away, I do want to remind you, Dorota already announced this, but please come back on April 1st for our art show, and there will be paintings and photography and puppets and dancing with artists from the L'Arche communities. And also we're going to have a lovely reception after that. So right now, though, there's a reception on... Dr. McHugh is anxious to get to the reception back there.
Where is the art show?
It will be on the second floor of this building. Thank you. So is at 6:30 on April 1st. Yeah, and the reception right now is on the second floor of this building. And the elevators are right back there, and then there are stairs on either side. Thank you. Thank you so much.